Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, I think my watch says 3, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Just telling Dr. Wakefield, can't be early, can't be late. Got to be on time. Welcome back this afternoon to the Prevatte lectures. We're welcoming Dr. Mark Goodacre here today, who is Francis Hill Fox Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University. Most of y'all were here this morning, so I won't go through the whole introduction again and give him plenty of time. This afternoon's lecture is on John for readers of the Synoptics, and we're going to hear a bit about who Dr. Goodacre believes to be the author behind this gospel. So turn it over to Dr. Goodacre.
Thank you again, Dr. Myers, and thank you everybody for coming for part 2. I did leave this morning's lecture on insofar as you have cliffhangers in academic work. I mean, they're the bar's quite low for academic cliffhangers. But anyway, insofar as we have them, I ended by saying that one of the issues with thinking about John as drama is that it has such a prominent narrator that would seem to be a problem with that thesis. Because typically speaking, if you're putting a play on and you have half the lines delivered by a narrator that's standing on the front of the stage, that just doesn't kind of work. You sometimes see people doing it in drama. Just occasionally, if you see a Jane Austen adaptation, they'll cast a figure, they'll call her Jane Austen, and then she'll introduce the action, but very rarely do they have her constantly there. It's a big challenge as well if you're doing something like Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, where the narrator is very prominent, and you really want to have someone telling the story. But anyway, John's Gospel has that narrator, and yet in other respects it's so dramatic. And one of the things I wanted to suggest is that those two things don't contradict one another, because the narrator in this Gospel is actually part of the drama, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in due course. But looking at the beloved disciple is going to be a challenge, because every single book on John's Gospel has to say something about this enigma. So you have to say something about beloved disciple. It's part of the job description of writing a book about John. But equally, since there's been 2,000 of years of people speculating about who is the beloved disciple, what's the chance you've got anything new or interesting to say about it? So it is a challenge. But I do like a challenge, and so I decided when I was writing a book about John's relationship with the Synoptics that one of the key questions to ask was, have we sufficiently paid attention to what it means to read John's Gospel against the background of the Synoptic Gospels, and does that shed light on the identity of the beloved disciple? And just to cut to the key point, just in case in half an hour you're dozing off a bit, because I know whenever I do afternoon lectures, I so struggle to stay awake the whole time. But the key point is that for most of Christian history, people have read the fourth gospel as the fourth gospel. They've read it alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And therefore, when you open up the pages of John's gospel, you are as soon as you see a mysterious, anonymous disciple, your mind goes to who could it be? And it goes to the characters that you've just met in the Synoptics. So that's the key thing I want to bring into the conversation. It's very rarely there as part of the conversation. I can't find anybody that's had an extended discussion of what it means to read the beloved disciple in the light of the Synoptic Gospels. So that's really the basic gist of the piece. And I'm not going to save you're not going to kind of wait till the end and then take the veil off and reveal who the beloved disciple is. I'll tell you who it is now. It's John, son of Zebedee. Okay? So, and that is, you might think, if you know anything about Johannine scholarship, that's the most ludicrously old-fashioned conservative opinion. Surely he's not going to argue for that. Well, I am. And, and I'll explain why shortly. But a little bit about the background of who the beloved disciple is and how he functions in the fourth gospel. He is first on the pages explicitly in John chapter 13 when he appears at the Last Supper. So we're already into the second half of the gospel. He is always, when he's mentioned after that, anonymous. He's never identified by name. And he's generally called the disciple whom Jesus loved. And the gospel claims a special authority because of the witness of this person. So he plays a kind of legitimizing role, a role that says you need to believe what you are reading on the pages of this gospel because a key figure that was involved in these events is behind them. If you look, for example, at John 19:35, and he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth so that you may also believe. So the role of the disciple there is basically saying, you have not any doubt, you should have no doubt about Jesus' death because the person behind this has actually seen this. It's a legitimizing role. You have the same thing at the resurrection, the second major resurrection section of John, in John 21. Some people think John 21 was added to the gospel later because John 20 looks like it provides a perfectly good conclusion. That's possible. John 21 is written very much in a similar style to the rest of the gospel. I'm perfectly happy to accept it as part of the earliest versions of the gospel. There are no extant early manuscripts that lack John 21, so I'll just go with it. John 21:24, this is the disciple who testifies to these things. Again, you see testimony is really, really key in John's gospel. This is the disciple who testifies to these things, and the one who wrote these things down, and we know that his testimony is true. And notice the pivot to the first person there. We know that his testimony is true, just as you get the first person plural right at the beginning of the gospel with we beheld his glory, which we'll come back to in a little bit. It's actually a very similar legitimizing device that you get here that you have also in other early Christian gospels. The Gospel of Thomas is a good example of this. I don't know how much you know about the Gospel of Thomas, but it's one of our oldest non-canonical gospels. I think it dates to about 140 or so, something like that, so it's really, really early. It was known very well in antiquity. It was very popular in antiquity. There are lots of references to it in antiquity, but it was lost for centuries. And it was only rediscovered fully in 1945 when the Nag Hammadi codices were discovered. And the second codex, Codex 2, has the Gospel of Thomas in there in a complete Coptic version. There are also some Greek fragments of it from the late 19th and early 20th century that were found in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. And really recently, there was a new fragment has been published. And I say recently, I mean August this year, like really recent. A little fragment called P-Oxy 5575 has been published. It's tiny, it's about like this big, but it has quotations from Matthew, Luke, and the Gospel of Thomas, and we don't know what it is, but it looks early. The best guess is it's either something that's using Matthew, Luke, and Thomas, or it's something that is a source for the Gospel of Thomas, but that's using Matthew and Luke. One thing that's certain is it's using Matthew and Luke. I can explain why, but I've got a podcast that explains why, if you want to listen to that. It was quite scary for me because because basically I spent a lot of my career arguing that Q didn't exist. It was a hypothetical early source, and then I started getting messages from people saying, Mark, they found Q, and I went, they haven't, they can't have done it and everything. Anyway, so I was quite relieved when I looked at it, and it looked nothing like people say that Q looked. Anyway. So that's an aside. But the Gospel of Thomas, for those that are not familiar with it, early Christian gospel, and it's supposedly written by Didymus Judas Thomas. That's Judas, Jesus' twin brother. He's not explicitly said to be Jesus' twin brother in the Gospel of Thomas, but later works, like the Acts of Thomas, he is also Jesus' twin brother. But he's definitely a twin in this. The word Thomas means twin. It's the Aramaic word for twin. And it says right at the beginning, these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Notice the similar way that it's using a figure who's in the action to legitimate these fresh teachings, these fresh sayings that are being produced. Because it was always a problem in antiquity. If you come along with a fresh literary work and say, look, I've got this new gospel, people are going to say, well, hold on a minute, how do we know that this has got any authentic material in it? You know, where did you get it from? And you say, well, A, this stuff was secret until now, and B, the figure that's bringing it forward is someone that was involved in Jesus' lifetime. So that's what's happening in Thomas, and I think something similar is happening in John, and you see it repeatedly in other early Christian works, not just Gospels, but other works. So that's the role I think the beloved disciple is playing in John's Gospel. He appears explicitly on several occasions. I mentioned the Last Supper as the first. The second one is that reference in the crucifixion story. Then we have him at the death of Jesus. And then in chapter 20, we have him at the vacated tomb. And in 21, he is there when Jesus appears to several of the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. If you want to know why I say vacated tomb rather than empty tomb, it's a little quibble. I wrote an article which was published last year, I think. It's called How Empty Was the Tomb? And it's basically arguing that the kind of tombs that are being described in the Gospels are multi-person tombs. And the Gospels all presuppose that it's a multi-person tomb. So the question isn't whether it's empty or not. Very few tombs were empty. The question is Jesus' body there? And that's why in the Gospels they never ask the question, is the tomb empty? No one ever used the term empty tomb until several centuries after the first century. What they asked was Jesus' body in the tomb? So it's an academic quibble. So I call it the vacated tomb, just to be idiosyncratic. It will never catch on. It will never catch on. Even people that have read my article, they still talk to me to my face and talk about the empty tomb. And I smile at them just to see if they notice that I've heard them. So that's the occasions when the beloved disciple appears. So who are the candidates that have traditionally been put forward for the beloved disciple? One very popular candidate is Lazarus, who first appears in John, as we saw earlier on in chapter 11. And one of the reasons why Lazarus is a very attractive candidate is that he is explicitly said to be someone who Jesus loves. So John 11:3, the sisters, that's Mary and Martha, sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." I think that's a very persuasive point. I think there was a while where I thought, yeah, that he really could be the person who's the beloved disciple. I think the thing is, though, there's two qualifications that you need to be the disciple that Jesus loved. One of them is to be loved. He's got that one, right? 10 out of 10. The other one, though, being a disciple, he hasn't got. So of the two things you need to be beloved disciple and loved, he's only got one of them. Lazarus is never said to be Jesus' disciple. And I think that's significant because, as we'll see a bit later on, one of the things that the fourth gospel seems to insist on is that this is a disciple. And just a quick word on this term disciple. I've been playing with the idea of translating it student, because the word in Greek, mathetes, if you translated it in any other context than biblical ones, you'd translate it student. So you talk about Jesus and his 12 students, right? The Greek word, that's the Greek word. The Latin word, discipulus, from which we'll get our disciple. If you do Duolingo Latin, I don't know if any of you do Duolingo, I do it to try and brush up on my languages. If you do Duolingo Latin, and it says discipulus, and you type in disciple, it will mark it wrong. I tried it. You have to say student. Some people use the term pupil, but for me, especially with the sort of, I think this is true probably more of British English than of other languages, but I think of a pupil as younger than a student. So you can be a graduate student and you can be, one of my graduate students was in his mid-70s once, so you can be a student of any age. Pupil tends to be, so I like the term student more, but a scholar, the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Cambridge University, George Van Kooten, he does use the term pupil when he refers to the beloved pupil. I've toyed with calling him the beloved student, just because I like to be idiosyncratic, so I say vacated tomb. But the thing is, I want people, when they Google, was John the beloved disciple, I want it to come up with my work, maybe on the sort of fourth page down or something like that. Whereas if I say student, I don't think anyone would actually Google for that. But it's a serious point that sometimes the way that we translate things depends on centuries of kind of inertia. So we've always called them disciples, so we always will call them disciples. But actually we hear something different when we say they're Jesus' students. And I just want to throw that key thing in. What about other possibilities? Nathaniel has come up on several occasions. David Catchpole argues that Nathaniel could be the beloved disciple. He is introduced right at the beginning of John's Gospel. He does seem to be someone quite special because Jesus praises him when he sees him. So could it be Nathaniel? Another possibility is Thomas. This has been argued by James Charlesworth, who wrote the comprehensive book on the beloved disciple, going through the history of the debate all the way through, and then coming up with one of the least plausible answers at the end of the book. I'm sorry, I just don't think Thomas is a great candidate for beloved disciple. And another really intriguing one is Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, as the beloved disciple, would actually explain why John does his best to keep the identity secret, because if there's a gender issue here, there might be good reason to keep it secret. After all, think even as recently as the Bronte sisters. I don't know about you, but I love reading the Brontes' novels, Emily Ann and Charlotte's novels. They actually published under a pseudonym. They made themselves Acton, Curris, and Ellis Bell, men's names, because they thought that no one would buy novels written by women. So you could see why someone in antiquity might pull this trick. And one of the things that supports it is that there are several 2nd and 3rd century works where Mary Magdalene is specifically isolated as someone that, not just that Jesus loves, but he loves more than anybody else. You get this in the Gospel of Mary. You get it hinted at in the Gospel of Philip, which is what gave rise to all the Da Vinci Code material. She's actually called his companion there, his koinonos. So there is something there in the relationship. It is either that John's Gospel really does have Mary Magdalene in view as the beloved disciple, and that's what other early Christian works like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary realized. Or it could be that because they were making Mary some kind of heroine, that what they do is they use that language that John has already introduced. And the anonymity of the beloved disciple in John enables them to do that in that kind of mysterious way. Sadly, I don't think it's Mary Magdalene. It's a very attractive option. I don't think it's Mary Magdalene. Perhaps the main reason that it's unlikely the beloved disciple is Mary Magdalene is that she appears alongside the beloved disciple in John 19:25 and following. You remember that there are 3 figures apparently at the cross. There is Mary, the mother of Jesus. John never calls her Mary, he just calls her the mother of Jesus. But there's the mother of Jesus, there's Mary Magdalene, and then apparently there is the beloved disciple, because Jesus addresses the beloved disciple from the cross, and he says, behold he addresses his mother and says, behold your son, and then he says to the beloved disciple, behold your mother. Now, Sandra Schneiders argues that when Jesus says, behold your son, Jesus is not telling his mother to look at the beloved disciple, but he's telling his mother to look at him on the cross. So behold your son here on the cross. It's a possible reading, but to me it's not a persuasive reading, because Jesus follows behold your mother with behold your son, and the parallelism suggests that he's addressing at once the beloved disciple and then at once the mother. So I think it's a possible reading, but I'm not fully persuaded by that reading, unfortunately, even though it's a very attractive one. And with any of these candidates, one of the difficulties is you still have to explain where the word John came from. In every single manuscript that we have, the author of John's Gospel is presupposed to be someone called John. There's no variant manuscripts where it's written by Mary Magdalene, Nathaniel, Lazarus, anybody else. It's always John, always John. So could it be another John? There are lots of Johns. Even in John's Gospel, explicitly, there's John the Baptist, and he refers, the first person mentioned in John's Gospel is John the Baptist, other than Jesus. So could it be another John? One very popular theory, and it's popular for good reasons, is that John's Gospel is written by John, but not John, son of Zebedee, not one of the 12. The theory is that there was an elder John who lived perhaps in Jerusalem, and that he is different from John, the son of Zebedee. I'm going to, on the handout, I didn't want to keep writing out John, son of Zebedee, so I've written J. I say Z in British English, JZ, but I could say JZ, but that's someone different, isn't it? Apparently, I don't know about young people's stuff, obviously, but so this person, the elder, he's a mysterious figure who does appear on the pages of the New Testament. In the second epistle of John, it's written by the elder to the elect lady and her children. And of course, that then raises the question, who is this? Could it be someone called John? Well, there does appear to be another John that's different from John, son of Zebedee, who is referred to by Papias. Papias came up in this morning's lecture, actually, in one of the questions. Now, Papias is writing probably early to middle 2nd century, and he has this fascinating, enigmatic saying, which I've put on the handout. I asked minutely after their sayings what Andrew or Peter said, or what was said by Philip, or by Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any of the Lord's disciples, which things Aristion and the elder John, the disciples of the Lord, say. For I imagined that what was to be got from books was not so profitable to me as what came from a living and abiding voice. So Papias talks about the elder John. A lot of people think this must be the same person that appears in the second epistle of John, and he seems to be separate from the John that's mentioned on the previous line, where he's paired with James. And we know from the Synoptic Gospels there are James and John, they're the two sons of Zebedee. One of the reasons it's so attractive to think that John the elder is the beloved disciple is that it gets you out of lots of the difficulties of John, son of Zebedee, being the beloved disciple. Because if you've got, let's say, a Jerusalem-based or a Judea-based disciple of Jesus who's kind of young, slightly different perspective from those that were from Galilee, you could get around the problem that John's gospel doesn't look like it was written by a Galilean fisherman, right? But it could be written by someone much more sophisticated who had the literary wherewithal to do it. And so that actually becomes quite a plausible possibility. I have been trying to work into, you know the phrase Johnny come lately, some Johnny come lately? I've been thinking, because it's John, and I've been trying to work that phrase into the chapter, but I can't find a good way of doing it. So if anyone can help me workshop whether or not we should prefer Jay-Z or some Johnny come lately as the beloved disciple, please help me out on that. So could this person be the beloved disciple? It's an attractive hypothesis, but I think there are problems with it, unfortunately. One is that nobody in antiquity associates this John with the beloved disciple. It's a modern theory. It's basically something that's emerged in the 20th century. It is supported by lots of great scholars, including Richard Borkham. In fact, Richard Borkham says that we must exorcise once and for all the idea that John, son of Zebedee, is the beloved disciple. And I very naughtily want to suggest that Borkham is a much better historian than he is an exorcist, because I don't think he's fully managed to exorcise John, son of Zebedee, from discussions of the beloved disciple. So no one in antiquity makes this particular John the author of the gospel or the beloved disciple, and that's quite telling. Given that he's a much less well-known John, it's surprising that he doesn't ever get associated with that role. But also, more importantly, the beloved disciple appears to be one of the 12 disciples. So the farewell discourses in John 13 to 17 are basically all addressed, it seems, to the 12. John doesn't use the term the 12 in these chapters, mainly because Judas, who is one of the 12, has already left the scene in chapter 13, but he generally talks about his disciples. And every time one of the disciples is named, it's someone that we know as being on the list of the 12 from the Synoptic Gospels. And he seems to make this an important thing, that they've always been people that have been with Jesus. So 13 verse 18, Jesus says, I know whom I have chosen. And then again we get it in 15, 16, 15, 19, the idea that Jesus chose people. And this idea of choosing comes from John 6, 70, when Jesus says, did I not choose you, the 12? And in 15:27, Jesus says, you, plural, have been with me from the beginning. This makes it difficult to think that that's where I could use the Johnny come lately, isn't it? Some Johnny come lately is a disciple now, rather than those who've been with Jesus all the way since Galilee. And so I've touched on something that I've alluded to already several times, which is John's gospel being read by many people in history who are also readers of the Synoptics. if you imagine yourself as a reader of John, as someone who also reads the Synoptics, it changes the way that you read the Johannine narrative. And so that's, I think, why, for most of history, people have said the beloved disciple is John, the son of Zebedee, because they are readers of the Synoptics. And I think for readers of the Synoptics, the beloved disciple has to be one of the 12. If you look at Matthew 26:20, for example, when they sit down to the Last Supper, the narrator says, when it was evening, Jesus reclined with his 12 disciples. And we have a very similar expression in John 13:23. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining close to his bosom. That's one of those parallels that you get between Matthew and John. And you get similar statements in Mark and Luke as well. So that, I think, is quite striking, that it looks like the reader of the Synoptics would think of the beloved disciple as being John. But this is also something that has history behind it in other ways. It's the traditional answer. At least as early as the 2nd century, people are associating the author of John's Gospel and the beloved disciple with John, son of Zebedee. It's explicit in the Apocryphon of John, which is another Gnostic work it appears alongside the Gospel of Thomas in Codex 2 from Nag Hammadi. And there it is explicitly said to be John, son of Zebedee, who is the one that is receiving revelation from Jesus and appears to be his right-hand person. You also get it already in Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century, the assumption that it's John the disciple who is the one who is responsible for the 4th Gospel. So this goes back really, really early. Moreover, John is part of the inner circle in the Synoptic Gospels. So Peter, James, and John get to see special things in the Synoptic Gospels. They're usually things that are connected in some way with Jesus' death and resurrection. So they're taken to one side in the story of Jairus' daughter in Mark 5 and parallels. Only Peter, James, and John go in, and this is a story about a resurrection. Then in chapter 9 of Mark, the Transfiguration, again it's got parallels in Matthew 17, Luke 9. At the Transfiguration, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, and they see Jesus transfigured before them, and it's a very kind of resurrection-like experience. These days, transfigured, I mentioned the word transfiguration in one of my classes, and the undergraduate students there didn't know the word from the Gospels, but knew it from Harry Potter. And so you have a new thing that they hear the word transfigured and they know it from Harry Potter and not from the Gospels, which amazed me, because I suppose for me it was the other way around. When I heard it in Harry Potter, I thought, oh, what fun, J.K. Rowling's using the word transfiguration. Anyway, so you have them present at the Transfiguration as well. And then you have them at Gethsemane. Jesus takes them to one side when Jesus is suffering, when he's experiencing that grief before the crucifixion. They're specially mentioned. There's also one occasion in Mark 13 where Peter, James, and John and Andrew are all together. So this is clearly some kind of special inner circle. So if you're a reader of John's Gospel and you see an anonymous character appearing alongside Peter who lives to tell the tale, the obvious deduction is that it's John. It can't be James if you're a reader of the Synoptics and Acts, because James, John's brother, dies already quite early on in Acts chapter 10, probably in the 40s, so he's not a good candidate, but John would remain a good candidate. And what's more, this John, son of Zebedee, is a key character in the early church. In our earliest literature, which is the epistles of Paul, John is a key character. In Galatians 2, he's described as one of the pillars. James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and John. Now, Paul doesn't say John, son of Zebedee, so I'm making an inference there, but that's the best guess. And in the early chapters of Acts, you have Peter and John pairing up together as well. Acts 5 is particularly clear. And given that John is never mentioned by name in John's Gospel, there's one reference to the sons of Zebedee in John 21, but John is otherwise never mentioned by name in John's Gospel, I think is conspicuous by his absence. I think to tell a story in which you go Peter, 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 and he was with someone else, and never to mention John, that is actually not an argument from silence. It's an argument about silence. The silence is significant. So I think that's significant too. So it's not surprising that for most people in history, the beloved disciple has been seen as John, son of Zebedee, and pretty much any popular Christian film, play will actually make the beloved disciple John. You see it all the time. Sometimes he's even conflated with John, the author of the book of Revelation, John of Patmos. In the History Channel series, The Bible, in 2013, he's both of those characters. In fact, they frame it with having John, son of Zebedee, on Patmos, about to receive the revelation about Revelation, that we go to the book of Revelation, but then they also have him appearing in the gospel narrative as well. But there's a problem with this character. I might just take a quick sip of water, if that's okay with you. There is a problem with this character, and New Testament scholars have been quick to point this out across the years. And so it's not just one problem, there's several. One is that the beloved disciple appears to be a kind of Jerusalem character. Whenever you see him, he's in Jerusalem. That doesn't sound anything like John, son of Zebedee, who was a fisherman in Capernaum, and you see him in Capernaum, in other areas of Galilee, in the Synoptic Gospels. So the beloved disciple has a Judean Jerusalem profile which would fit better with somebody else and not John, son of Zebedee. Most particularly, the real problem is the beloved disciple is known to the high priest. So in John chapter 18, it's the story of Peter's denial, but Jesus has also just been arrested. The way that Peter enters the courtyard is because the beloved disciple is known to the high priest and lets him into those inner workings. That would surely rule out John, son of Zebedee. How could a Galilean fisherman be known to the high priest in Jerusalem? That sounds like nuts. I think both of those alleged difficulties have straightforward refutations. The appearance of a Jerusalem-based disciple is actually completely illusory. John 13 to 21 is basically an extended weekend at the end of the gospel, and during the same extended weekend, John, son of Zebedee, is prominent in the Synoptic Gospels. So if you read the Synoptics, that's where John, son of Zebedee, is prominent. So for example, in Luke 22, 7 to 13, they're about to get the Passover ready. Who gets it ready? Peter and John, paired, just as they are, the same day in John's Gospel, in John 13. In Mark 14, as I've already mentioned, we've got the Gethsemane story in which Peter, James, and John are with Jesus in Gethsemane. So again, John is explicitly mentioned by name in this Jerusalem phase. And what's more, the whole premise that the beloved disciple is a Jerusalem-based disciple is false if you read John 21, where the beloved disciple is very much at home in Galilee, because Jesus has returned to Galilee, he is fishing, there is talking about following Jesus. The whole scene, as every scholar will tell you, is evoking the story of the call of the disciples from Mark 1, Matthew 4, Luke 5, where Peter, James, John, and Andrew were called. So in fact, what we get is a kind of origin story at the end, or an echo of the origin story. So the beloved disciple, when he's treated for the longest time in John, because that's the longest passage dealing with the beloved disciple, he's a Galilean disciple. So how could he be a friend of the high priest? That's, Do you know, it took me about 2 years to fathom this one out. I spent a while just thinking, oh, well, maybe John made that up. Maybe the author, maybe he did. But I'm not happy with that as a reason, because why would the author of John's Gospel make up that John, son of Zebedee, was friends with the high priest? I couldn't get to the bottom of it. But as all of you that are studying Greek here at Campbell University Divinity School know, always read the Greek. Yeah? Because what does it say? What I've done an English translation of it so that we're not just staring at the Greek, but I've put the relevant words in. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Wait a minute. Another disciple, no article, not the other disciple, and not the disciple whom Jesus loved, just another disciple. Allos mathetes. Since that disciple, the one I've just mentioned that I've just introduced for the first time, another disciple, since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. What people who think that this is the beloved disciple will always point to is that John says, the other disciple. And they say, well, hold on a minute. There's Peter and there's the other disciple. There's only one person you could realistically call the other disciple. And that must be the beloved disciple. No, it doesn't. The other disciple is the person he's just introduced as another disciple and that disciple. It's the third time he's mentioned him, and now he feels confident he can say the other disciple, and people won't confuse him with the beloved disciple. But just in case, he says the one that's known to the high priest, i.e. not the beloved disciple, who's not been mentioned as the beloved disciple. So I think it's completely bogus. I started running through commentaries just to see how many people think that this is the beloved disciple. The majority opinion is that this is the beloved disciple. I think that's one of these cases where people have just got seduced into thinking it this way because they've always thought it that way. And I know this is the case because I used to think it. I thought it for years until I actually went back and reread the Greek, which is always worth doing, like I was saying. So that removes the difficulties with the idea that John, son of Zebedee, is the beloved disciple. And so at that point, I then want to bring back in the question of John's readers as readers of the Synoptics. Now, I've been trying to sort of talk about the history of the reception of John. One of the things that's been a very welcome development in New Testament scholarship over the last generation or so is people paying attention to the way in which gospel works are received, how people read them in history. We've taken a fresh look at ancient interpreters, medieval interpreters, modern interpreters, and so on. And this is key when it comes to this area, because the history of the reception of John's Gospel is a history of readers that have read John in the light of the Synoptics. That's why they've concluded the beloved disciple is John. Unlike us modern scholar types that insist we must read John as John and we must read Matthew as Matthew and we must read Mark as Mark. That's all true. It's really important to stress the differences between the Gospels. But the difficulty is that sometimes we end up believing our own rhetoric too much, and we get so obsessed with reading John's Gospel on its own that we forget that across history it's been read alongside the Synoptics. But that also then raises a really interesting question, because if readers of John across history have made John, the son of Zebedee, the beloved disciple, could it be that the author meant it that way? And if John, the author of the Gospel, it gets difficult, doesn't it, with John, the author of the Gospel, and John, the beloved disciple, but if the author of the Gospel himself knew the Synoptic Gospels, then it might be he's inviting us to make that identification ourselves. And if John, the author of the Gospel, knew the Synoptic Gospels, then presumably he would expect lots of his readers to know the Synoptic Gospels, in which case he knew that they would make the identification as well. Completely open to him as an author at that point to say, this is a different character, and to put John, son of Zebedee, alongside him. But I'm suggesting the author must have known that readers will make that identification. Makes it more possible that he's not just allowing the identification, he's inviting it. He's inviting the reader to make that identification with John, son of Zebedee. And if that is the case, and of course, I've mentioned that this is a chapter in a longer book, so this will be chapter 5 after the chapter 4 that we heard earlier on, and I hope by this stage of the book people are at least entertaining the possibility that John knew the Synoptic Gospels. Then we actually can entertain the possibility that John expected his first readers to know the Synoptics. Then you have to say, is there anything more than a subtle invitation to identify the beloved disciple with John? And I think there is. There are a couple of things. Okay, first thing is, the beloved disciple arguably appears in chapter 1. It is subtle, but it's interesting. You have 2 disciples mentioned, and Andrew is one of these 2 disciples, and Andrew goes to find his own brother, Now, we know from the Synoptic Gospels that the same period of Jesus' ministry, there's another pair of brothers, James and John. So that might be a subtle indication already that the anonymous disciple that he's not mentioned, who was alongside Andrew, is John. But far more persuasive than that, I think, is a clue that's right there at the beginning of the Gospel. The thing is, John 1:14, the Word became flesh, is so dazzling in its theological implications that we often don't read the rest of the sentence. I was brought up with going to 9 lessons and carols services. In fact, I went to one this last Christmas in Peterborough Cathedral, and you would have 9 lessons and carols, and the 9th one was always John 1, and it would always end with John 1:14. They don't even read verses 15 and following. So the Word was made flesh. But it goes on, he tabernacled amongst us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. What we have in that verse, and I'm absolutely not the first person to notice this is frequently pointed out in the commentaries without people realizing the implications. This is very clearly alluding to the transfiguration story in the Synoptics. The verb that John uses, tabernacling amongst us, is kind of strange, but when you remember in the transfiguration story, Peter, James, and John want to build tabernacles for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. So you have a verbal link there. In the transfiguration story, God speaks out and says, "This is my son, the chosen." Very similar to here, the Father's only Son. So you have a Christological link here with the Synoptic transfiguration story. And then most striking, I think, is the line, "We beheld his glory," when the narrator moves into the first person and introduces himself as a character in the drama. And there is only one time in the Synoptic Gospels where you have a character or characters seeing Jesus' glory, and it's in the Transfiguration story. In Luke's version of that, in Luke's editing of the Markan story, the disciples see Jesus' glory. So I think that what's happening here is in the same way that you get synoptic narration turning into direct speech, as we saw earlier on, you here have the narrator identifying himself as a character in the story. Admittedly mysterious, enigmatic, that's half the fun. It makes you want to reread the book if it's mysterious and enigmatic. But the clues are there. And the clues are there especially if you do read John alongside the Synoptic Gospels. I think that's where I'd like to pause with that piece, if that's okay. And happy to listen to any thoughts or questions.
Can I be annoying and ask the first
Go for
question
it.
as a John person? Why then have the revelation of Jesus' glory in 2:11? What do you do with that?
Well, I suppose that's after the wedding at Cana.
Yeah. It moves this glory revelation, and it's not just these 3 disciples,
Right.
but it's all of the disciples gathered. Yeah.
I think what happens in John basically is I think he doesn't like the transfiguration, at least as a kind of a single moment where a select few get to see Jesus' glory, and is inspired by that to extend it across Jesus' whole ministry. So I think that's what's going on there, because it's not just the disciples that witness his glory there, but he talks about Isaiah having seen his glory.
Right, Isaiah sees his glory, but
Yeah.
also seems like
Yeah.
an extension of the Exodus 33.
Yeah.
Is John bringing this extra layer of scriptural interpretation to the synoptic traditions? Like Matthew, of course,
Yeah.
brings his own view of scripture to interpreting Mark's narratives, but kind of the way that John is interpreting these synoptic stories through scripture with his own kind of tweak to them,
Yes.
that maybe highlights Exodus 33 and 34 and Isaiah 40 and 55.
No, absolutely. And I think what's actually going on is it's almost like a democratizing of those that can see Jesus' glory.
Isaiah 55 with the going out of the word to
yeah,
everyone.
no, absolutely. So I think the problem with the transfiguration is it's temporal and it's too small. And what John is doing, it's taking its lead from it, but then expanding it outwards, as he does with lots of other things as well in time. I mean, there's the whole Bultmann thing of, when is Jesus lifted up? Is he lifted up on the cross? Is it the resurrection? Is it the ascension? Is it the parousia? So I think it's extended in time and extended in scope, but still with a catalyst from the transfiguration is what I would say.
Do you think then the we gets extended?
Yeah, I think so.
Like from one, because Jesus,
Yeah.
of course, uses the we in chapter 3. When we get that kind of funky, we're heading into who's talking here.
Yeah.
We speak about what we know.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that, yeah. I mean, to some extent, I think what's happening with the beloved disciple is there's a problem with Mark's gospel, I think. And one of the problems with Mark's gospel is the disciples are just so negative that you do start wondering, well, how could these people actually ever go and testify to anything? And I think John fixes that with the figure of the beloved disciple, but who then actually also has to be, a representative figure in some ways of other people that also see Jesus' glory and also understand and also witness. So I think he kind of fixes Mark's disciple problem a bit.
Well, and then you solve the tragedy of the distance from the risen Christ, right? That the distance with the remembrance becomes inspired instead of threatening. It's we understand more now that time has passed for reflection.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Right.
Very provocative, and I'm almost persuaded, but I want to raise 3 issues. One is simply the puzzle of why, if John, the son of Zebedee, is active in chapter 1, why is it not until chapter 13 that he begins to be identified in this provocative and unusual way? So that's number one. Second is the question of other disciples who have been with Jesus from the beginning, at least Acts suggests there's a lot more options than just the ones that we've named. And the third is the allos, other disciple. It seems like the argument about silence might apply here too. If you're talking about Peter and another disciple and you don't name that other disciple, who else are you going to think of? So three devil's advocate questions.
No, they're all really helpful. The last one first. The thing is, we do have other disciples that pop up unexpectedly in John. One of them is Joseph of Arimathea, who is identified as being a disciple, but a secret one because of the Judeans. So the idea of having prominent Jerusalem people popping up as disciples unexpectedly is there. The strange thing there is he doesn't identify him. I mean, I'm surprised that he doesn't. I think he could easily have said it was, Zechariah the disciple, or Bobby the disciple. I don't know, but so yeah. But the thing is, I suppose it's one of those things. It's an interesting counterfactual. The only reason why people have identified him with the beloved disciple is because John failed to name him, and maybe he should have done. I don't know, but yes, it's a good point. The question of why he doesn't bring the beloved disciple in more in the first half of the gospel is a really interesting one. I don't have a good solution to that one, but except to say that the individual members of the 12 all start becoming more vocal in the second half of the gospel. So it's there that we meet Judas, not Iscariot, for the first time. It's there we meet Thomas for the first time. It's there that Philip we've already had in chapter 6, but Philip comes back again. So I suppose it's that the audience is suddenly much smaller in the farewell discourses. And you've got this rich tapestry in the first half. You've got the Samaritan woman, you've got Nicodemus, you've got the man born blind, you've got the paralyzed man in chapter 5. You've got all of this array of characters. But then we're just in the upper room just with a handful. And so in a way you'd expect the beloved disciple to come forward there. I think that'd be my best explanation of it. I can't remember the second one.
The reference to other disciples who were with him from the beginning.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, oh, good point. So in other words, yeah, there's people other than the 12. Yeah, that's true. And it's a difficult one. But I think those that argue for John the Elder often say that he was probably based in Judea, and therefore I don't see how he can be with them from the beginning unless he's some kind of Judean disciple. And it's just an inference. It's not something that the fourth gospel is actually saying. So, yeah, but it's true. There are those from the beginning. Matthias pops up from nowhere, and then we never hear of him ever again after Acts 1. So. Oh yeah, Barsabbas. Joseph is he Barsabbas, isn't he? Yeah, I think he's Joseph Bar Sabbas, I think it's called, isn't he? Yeah. No, that's right. Well, and likewise, I often speculate on Romans 16:7, where we've got Andronicus and Junior, and Paul says they were in Christ before him, and he calls them apostles. So Paul thinks that apostles are people that have seen Jesus. So they're presumably people that were known to Jesus during his lifetime. So yeah, there's certainly lots more of these around. And then we can extend it out. It gets very gendered when you just talk about the 12, but I mean, Luke brings forward Joanna as well, early in the ministry, and then again at the resurrection. We've got Salome popping up in Mark. We've already talked about Mary Magdalene, so we have lots more of those characters as well. Yeah, that's a really good point, though. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks so much for the lecture, and I think you make a strong case that the author has left enough hints that we're intended to think the writer is John, son of Zebedee. What I'd love to hear you do, I'm assuming that you're not arguing that John, son of Zebedee, actually wrote it, but it's written later like many pseudepigraphal works, and somebody is pretending to be John. Can you give us a brief stab at when you think that happened, and
Sure.
any idea, any hints as to who might be good candidates for actually being the author?
I was hoping someone might push me on this. Yeah, I think it's fictional. I don't think that John, son of Zebedee, actually wrote the fourth gospel. I think that an anonymous author wanted to imply that he had. And I've toyed with the idea that one of the reasons for the anonymity is that it's quite a bold move to do that. It becomes much less bold as the years go on. So, I mean, I know these things don't always move on straight lines, but Mark's gospel, very strikingly anonymous. No authorial self-representation at all. Never says, I did this, we did that. Matthew, same. Nothing. Luke, first person, just to include himself in the story. So you get first person in the preface, Luke 1:1-4, and then halfway through Acts, we find out that it's a companion of Paul, anonymous as well, just like the beloved disciple. And I think Luke and John are doing something quite similar there. I think that they are trying to bring themselves as characters into a story in which they actually weren't characters. So some people I know will be unhappy with that suggestion. As time then goes on, you get to Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, very happy to make out that their named disciples were actually there. Nobody seriously thinks that the Gospel of Thomas was written by the disciple Thomas, or that Peter was written by Peter, or that Proto-Evangelium of James was written by Jesus' brother, but there's a boldness that comes with the decades passing, and that just continues, and you carry on seeing the 3rd, 4th centuries and so on. So that's my best guess of what's going on. I think we're still early enough that there's a kind of anxiety about being too bold in the authorial self-representation, but we're late enough that they need some kind of authenticating figure to say, hey, this is really good stuff, this is. I wouldn't rule out that the author of the fourth gospel has some sort of, dialogue partner or someone that he thinks can actually, link him back to the original Jesus movement, but it's very difficult to, that's just pure speculation. It's difficult to know. And its analogies, I think, are with things like Thomas.
I mean, it's interesting with the pneumatology, too, because it kind of justifies that. Well,
That's right.
Because we're all one and
Yeah.
we're all connected, I can make
Yeah.
this claim,
Yeah.
sort of.
And the sort of, the Spirit will bring all these things back to your mind.
They are congruent, right?
Yeah,
Like the narrator
yeah.
sounds like Jesus because we're all connected in the
Yeah,
Spirit,
yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Any other questions? Yeah.
One idea, instead of saying Johnny come lately, you could say Johnny come elderly, maybe?
Very nice,
Yeah,
very
it's
nice.
sure
Yeah,
fun to
yeah,
know.
that's good.
I'm sure you've thought about this, but I mean, a couple of things, but just the fact that, like, Sinaiticus
corrector does put the definite article there.
Does
in
it?
1815,
Oh, I'd
yeah,
forgotten
the
that.
other.
Okay.
And Ephraimi does too. So, you know, speaking of how they've read it for a while, I mean, I don't know if that would necessarily affect your case, but I'd be interested to hear you like ponder, okay, what did that copyist then think?
Yeah.
Or whom did they think that was referring to?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'll add that. I'll take a proper look.
But yeah, just 21:2, just the kind of laconic reference to the sons of Zebedee. I mean, if that's the guy behind this, I mean, you can't plug every hole in any of these theories, obviously.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I definitely find a lot of Balkum stuff really compelling. Not going to downhill for it, but I mean, how would you explain that? And would you, because it does seem like those two other disciples in 21:2 seems to imply, if I'm just reading that chapter, that the beloved disciple is one of those. But do you think that's not much of a problem, the way he just refers to the sons of Zebedee?
Well, I think I think what those verses show it's a tease. I mean, if you've not identified the disciple all this time, and then you get to the end and it's like, oh, we're going to find out who he is, and then instead of finding out who he is, we're teased with, well, it could be one of the sons of Zebedee, it could be Nathaniel, and then I'll throw in two more anonymous ones as well. It's a great way of teasing the reader. So you actually end up finding nothing. But I think saying sons of Zebedee, just for what it's worth, it puts them in your mind. So if I say now, nobody think of an elephant, like an elephant comes in your mind, right? So if you say right at the end, when you're just about to identify the beloved disciple and the sons of Zebedee were there, and there were two other anonymous people, well, what can I do with two anonymous people? They don't pop in, I just think of blank faces. But you've said sons of Zebedee, and I'm thinking it. It's the same way in the secret gospel of Mark, you have an extraordinary line where Clement of Alexandria supposedly says that the line naked man with naked man is not found in the text. And he's denying that you have the line naked man with naked man, and what it makes the reader think is naked man with naked man. And then that makes you read the text in that light. So it's I think it's one of those things, I do think it's a tease, I really do. I can't prove that, but it is a good literary method of making someone present right at the last minute, but then pulling back again from it.
But if his readers really do know the Synoptics well, is he able to tease them as well? Or do you think his ability to tease depends on their
Well, I think,
knowing
yeah,
the
the tease depends on the Synoptics there, because who are the sons of Zebedee?
Okay.
I mean, like, if you've not read the Synoptics, I mean, we've never had Zebedee mentioned.
Okay.
Incidentally, we do, of course, have the mother of the sons of Zebedee in Matthew just before this. And so she does suddenly pop up there, which is kind of interesting. And there you've got a mother-daughter, a mother-son relationship thing.
Thanks.
But no, thank you. I had a graduate student once which thought that piece, that the mention of the sons of Zebedee in 21 excluded John from being the beloved disciple, but I don't think so. I think it's a tease.
Isn't that part of Mary Ann Mai Thompson's argument against? I thought
That,
it was.
that they
But
can't be because,
yeah, because of that.
Yeah, lots of people,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah. And not just her, there's quite a
Yeah, a
few
lot.
people that say it excludes them.
Yeah.
What I think I need to do is, I've written this chapter already, but I haven't been able to find a really good ancient example of someone doing the tease. There's tons of modern examples, but I need an ancient example of someone doing something similar.
Feels like Lucian would do something like that, but it's later.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
no, I mean,
It's
maybe
still,
it's not.
yeah, but might be
It's in
ancient
the
enough.
ballpark.
Yeah, okay.
It feels like a Lucian move.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, could be. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Well, last one, and then you can close us out as the dean.
Any comments on the idea about a Johannine community development that takes place over time, that kind of idea?
Well, I feel like the Johannine community, like I feel about layers of tradition and oral traditions and hypothetical lost documents. There's no doubt that many documents that existed no longer exist. And there's no doubt that communities that existed, are difficult to find. So I do think John must have had a community. He's clearly not writing in isolation. But whether or not we as scholars have the ability to discern that community on the pages of the gospel, that's where I'm skeptical. In the same way that I firmly believe that we have lost many, many, many great ancient works. We know we have because people refer to them. But our ability to reconstruct them on the basis of what we have, that's where I'm skeptical. So I am a Johannine community skeptic, I must say.
And I affirm you in that.
That's great, thank you. The letters, I know, yeah. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on my colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Hugo Mendez, because he's writing on this at the moment.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let's thank Dr. Goodacre for
Thank you. Thanks.
a
Appreciate it.
wonderful day, and thank you all for being here and participating. So we'll see you later.